My blood ran cold as I stared at the severed power lines, dangling like forgotten jump ropes. The air crackled with a silent accusation, and the sickening realization hit me with the force of a wrecking ball: someone had deliberately cut my electricity. A shiver of fury traced its way down my spine, quickly replaced by a burgeoning plan. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an act of war, and a particular Karen in our HOA, Mrs. Albright, immediately came to mind. Little did she know, her little escapade was about to cost her $80,000. It all began when my grandmother, bless her kind soul, decided to move to a warmer climate. She left me her house, a charming, albeit slightly run-down, bungalow nestled in a quaint little community called Willow Creek. I had always loved visiting her there, the scent of honeysuckle clinging to the air, the sound of cicadas buzzing in the summer evenings. It was a peaceful place, or so I thought. Moving in was a whirlwind of unpacking boxes and painting walls, transforming the space into my own while still honoring her memory. The first few weeks were a dream. I'd wake up to the sun streaming through the windows, enjoy my coffee on the small porch, and wave to the friendly faces walking their dogs. The neighborhood felt like a warm embrace, a perfect escape from the hustle and bustle of city life. One sunny afternoon, I was out in the front yard, meticulously pruning the overgrown rose bushes that lined the walkway. My hands were covered in gardening gloves, and I was humming a tuneless song, enjoying the simple rhythm of the work. A shadow fell over me, and I looked up to see a woman standing at the edge of my lawn, arms crossed, a severe expression on her face. She was impeccably dressed, even for a casual stroll, and her gaze was sharp, like she was cataloging every stray leaf. "Good afternoon," I offered, trying to be friendly, wiping a bit of dirt from my cheek. She didn't return the greeting. Instead, her eyes narrowed as she scrutinized my vibrant petunias. "Are you aware, young lady," she began, her voice crisp and unyielding, "that the color palette of your floral arrangements deviates significantly from the approved HOA guidelines for Willow Creek?" I blinked, genuinely confused. "I'm sorry, what guidelines?" I had received a welcome packet, but it was mostly about trash collection schedules and common area rules. Nothing about flower colors. Section 3, subsection B, paragraph 4, she recited, as if from memory, states that all visible flora from the street must adhere to a muted, earth-toned palette to maintain the aesthetic integrity of the community. She then pointed a perfectly manicured finger at my cheerful red and yellow petunias. "Those," she declared, with a dramatic sweep of her hand, "are an absolute eyesore and a blatant disregard for our community standards." I was dumbfounded. Muted earth tones? For flowers? It sounded utterly ridiculous. "With all due respect," I said, trying to keep my voice even, "I don't recall seeing anything about flower colors in the materials I received." A huff escaped her lips. "Ignorance of the rules is no excuse, young lady. I am Mrs. Albright, head of the Architectural Review Committee, and I assure you, I know these rules inside and out. You have exactly 48 hours to replace those monstrosities with something more appropriate. Failure to comply will result in a fine." With that, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving me standing amidst my monstrosities, feeling a mixture of bewilderment and irritation. That was my first introduction to Mrs. Albright, and it set the tone for what would become a constant, low-level hum of conflict. It wasn't just the flowers. Soon, there were notices about my mailbox being a quarter-inch too low, a complaint about the length of my grass, even though I had mowed it just days before, and even a passive-aggressive note about the excessive cheerfulness of my garden gnome. Each interaction, each notice, felt like a tiny pinprick, designed to needle and annoy. I tried to be reasonable, to understand her perspective, but her demands were often outlandish and seemed rooted in a desire for control rather than genuine community improvement. I even attended an HOA meeting, hoping to gain some clarity or find allies, but Mrs. Albright dominated the proceedings, her voice ringing with authority, and most of the other residents seemed too intimidated to challenge her. One particularly sweltering afternoon, I had an unexpected emergency. My elderly neighbor, Mr. Henderson, who lived alone and relied on a specialized medical device, had his air conditioning unit break down. The heat was unbearable, and his health was rapidly deteriorating. I called a local HVAC technician, but they were swamped and couldn't get to him for hours. Seeing his distress, I remembered an old, portable AC unit I had in my garage. It was a bit clunky and loud, but it worked. Without a second thought, I wheeled it over to his house, ran the extension cord from my outdoor outlet, and threaded it through his open window. It was a temporary solution, but it brought him immediate relief, and the grateful look on his face made all the effort worthwhile. I explained the situation to Mrs. Albright when she happened to walk by, thinking she would understand. Instead, her lips thinned into a tight line. "Is that extension cord UL approved for outdoor continuous use?" she asked, her eyes narrowing at the orange cord snaking across my lawn. I stammered, "It's just for a few hours, Mrs. Albright." Mr. Henderson needed help. "Rules are rules, young lady. And that cord," she gestured dismissively, "is a clear violation of electrical safety guidelines, not to mention a blight on the aesthetic of our perfectly manicured lawns." The sheer lack of empathy was astounding. I tried to explain the urgency, the medical need, but she simply shook her head and walked away, muttering about setting precedents. A few days later, a formal violation notice arrived in my mailbox, complete with a photograph of the offending extension cord and a hefty fine. I paid it, not because I agreed with it, but because I didn't want to cause more trouble for Mr. Henderson, and honestly, I was tired of fighting. My resolve, however, was tested again when a huge storm hit Willow Creek. The winds howled like angry beasts, and rain lashed against the windows. Trees swayed violently, and the power flickered on and off throughout the night. The next morning, the neighborhood was a mess of downed branches and scattered debris. My own power was out, which was inconvenient, but I knew the utility company would be working hard to restore it. I spent the morning clearing my yard, dragging fallen branches to the curb, and checking on Mr. Henderson. His power was out too, and he seemed a bit more frail than usual, worried about his medical equipment. I assured him everything would be okay, trying to project a calmness I didn't entirely feel. Later that afternoon, a utility truck rumbled down the street. I watched from my porch as the crew worked diligently, repairing lines and restoring power to various houses. They bypassed mine, which I found odd. A few hours later, still no power. I called the utility company, and after a lengthy wait, a customer service representative informed me that my service line appeared to be severed. Severed? That sounded deliberate, not like storm damage. They promised to send a crew to investigate first thing in the morning. The next day, as the utility truck pulled up, I walked out to meet the technician, a kind-faced woman named Brenda. She took one look at my main service line, leading from the power pole to my house, and let out a low whistle. "Well, that's not right," she murmured, pointing to a clean, precise cut in the thick cable. "This wasn't storm damage. This was done with a tool. A pretty strong one, too." My heart sank. Someone had deliberately cut my power. But who? Then, like a bolt of lightning, the image of Mrs. Albright, with her perfectly manicured hands and an almost obsessive need for control, flashed in my mind. She had been particularly agitated about the temporary extension cord I ran to Mr. Henderson's house, even after the emergency was over. Could she have done this? It seemed extreme, even for her. Yet, the possibility gnawed at me. As Brenda worked to splice the lines, she commented, "You know, this is a pretty serious offense. Tampering with utility lines can lead to massive fines, not to mention the danger involved." The power hummed back to life, filling my house with a welcome sense of normalcy, but my mind was anything but calm. The thought of someone deliberately cutting my power, potentially endangering Mr. Henderson and me, filled me with a cold dread. I knew I needed to investigate. I couldn't just let this go. And then, a small detail Brenda mentioned about massive fines started to echo in my head. If this was indeed Mrs. Albright, she was about to learn a very expensive lesson. This wasn't just about my electricity anymore. This was about principle. This was about standing up to someone who believed they were above the rules, who thought they could dictate every aspect of our lives in Willow Creek. The thought of $80,000 made my lips twitch slightly. If I could prove it, if I could gather the evidence, she wouldn't just get a slap on the wrist. She would face a consequence that truly reflected the severity of her actions. My mind raced, already formulating a plan. The game was on. The revelation that my power lines were deliberately cut hung heavy in the air, a thick cloud of suspicion settling over me. The very idea that someone would go to such lengths, especially over something as trivial as an extension cord, was unsettling. I knew, deep down, that Mrs. Albright was the most likely culprit. Her history of over-the-top reactions and her unwavering belief in her own authority pointed directly to her. But suspicion wasn't proof, and I needed proof if I was going to do anything about this. The thought of confronting her without solid evidence filled me with a mix of dread and determination. I imagined her icy stare, her dismissive wave of the hand, the way she could make you feel like a naughty child. Still, I wasn't a child, and this wasn't about a gnome or some petunias. This was different. This felt dangerous. The first step was to gather whatever information I could. My immediate thought was security cameras. Many houses in Willow Creek had them, and I hoped someone might have captured something, even a fleeting glimpse of Mrs. Albright near my property during the time my power was out. I started with Mr. Henderson, my kind neighbor. He was frail, but his mind was sharp, and he had a small camera mounted near his front door, mainly to see who was at his doorstep. I explained the situation, keeping my voice calm even though my insides were churning with frustration. He listened intently, his brow furrowing with concern. "That's just awful, dear," he said, his voice raspy. "Cutting someone's power, why, that's a serious matter indeed. Let me see what my camera captured. It records motion, you know." He slowly navigated his way to his computer, a much older model than mine, and painstakingly pulled up the video footage from the night of the storm and the following morning. We watched patiently as the blurry images flickered across the screen, trees swaying in the wind, rain lashing down, and then, a figure. It was dark, obscured by the weather and the angle, but it was undoubtedly a person, moving stealthily towards my house. The figure paused near where my power line connected, seemed to do something, and then quickly retreated. The quality wasn't good enough to make out a face, but the time stamp was there. It was late in the evening, after the storm had mostly passed, but before the utility company had come out. "It's not clear enough to identify anyone, is it?" I asked, a lump forming in my throat. It was frustratingly close, yet so far. Mr. Henderson sighed. "No, not really. Too bad. But it definitely looks like someone was messing with your lines." He paused, then added, "You know, Mrs. Albright often takes her evening strolls around that time, especially if she's inspecting properties. She's quite particular about her routine." His words, though not an accusation, felt like a confirmation of my deepest suspicions. Next, I decided to take a more direct approach, albeit a subtle one. I knew Mrs. Albright was often outside, tending to her pristine rose garden, which, ironically, was filled with vibrant, earth-toned blooms. I walked over to her house, a forced smile plastered on my face. "Good morning, Mrs. Albright," I chirped, trying to sound overly cheerful, almost annoyingly so. She looked up from pruning a particularly thorny bush, her eyes narrowing. "Good morning, young lady. I trust your power has been restored?" Her voice was laced with an unnerving politeness, almost a challenge. "Oh, yes, eventually," I replied, affecting a casual shrug. "Turns out, someone cut the lines. Can you believe it? With some kind of tool, too. The utility company said it was a deliberate act. Imagine that. Someone actually going out of their way to cause trouble for a neighbor." I watched her closely. Her expression remained impassive, but there was a flicker, a tiny tightening around her eyes, that I didn't miss. "It makes you wonder, doesn't it?" I continued, pressing lightly, "who would do such a thing? And why?" She snipped a dead rose head with a sharp click. "Indeed," she said, her voice flat. "Some people have no respect for others' property, or for the peace and order of our community." She then changed the subject abruptly, launching into a detailed complaint about a new resident down the street who had installed a brightly colored bird feeder, completely ignoring my veiled questions. It wasn't an admission, but her reaction, or lack thereof, combined with the quick deflection, spoke volumes. My gut feeling hardened into a conviction. The next few days were a blur of research. I spent hours online, looking up HOA regulations, local ordinances regarding utility tampering, and even previous HOA-related lawsuits. I discovered that tampering with utility lines was not just an HOA violation, but a serious criminal offense, carrying hefty fines and even potential jail time. More importantly, I found a little-known clause in our HOA's bylaws, one that stated any damages incurred by a resident due to willful negligence or malicious acts of another resident could result in the offending party being held financially responsible for all costs associated with the damage, including fines imposed by external entities. This was the key. This was how I could hit her with that $80,000 fine. That the massive fines Brenda from the utility company mentioned could be passed directly to Mrs. Albright. I carefully documented everything: the date and time the power went out, the utility company's diagnosis, Brenda's exact words, Mr. Henderson's inconclusive but telling video footage, and even Mrs. Albright's peculiar reaction during our conversation. I started a dedicated folder on my computer, filled with screenshots, notes, and legal clauses. It felt like I was building a case, piece by painstaking piece. The sheer audacity of Mrs. Albright's actions fueled my determination. This wasn't just about money, it was about holding her accountable, about making her understand that her reign of terror had consequences. One afternoon, a delivery truck pulled up to Mrs. Albright's house. I watched casually from my window as a large, heavy-duty package was unloaded. It was a brand-new, industrial-grade hedge trimmer, the kind that could cut through thick branches with ease. It struck me as odd. Mrs. Albright always seemed to prefer delicate pruning shears for her roses. Why such a powerful tool? A chilling thought crept into my mind. Could she have used something like that to cut my power lines? The utility technician had said, a tool, a strong one. A hedge trimmer, especially one designed for thick landscaping, certainly fit that description. The timing felt too coincidental. My mind raced. If she had purchased that specific tool around the time of the incident, it could be a piece of circumstantial evidence. I didn't know how I would prove it, but the idea lodged itself firmly in my brain. The image of the cut wires, so clean and precise, now aligned perfectly with the kind of cut a powerful cutting tool would make. It was a terrifying realization, confirming the deliberate nature of the act. The thought of confronting her with this new piece of information sent a shiver down my spine, but also a surge of cold determination. I needed to find a way to connect that hedge trimmer to the cut power lines. The stakes felt incredibly high now. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a brazen, calculated act of sabotage. And the fear that she might try something even more extreme if she felt cornered began to creep into my thoughts. I knew I was playing with fire, but I also knew I couldn't back down. Not now. The sight of Mrs. Albright's new, powerful hedge trimmer gnawed at me. It felt like a missing puzzle piece, the silent accomplice to the crime. My immediate task was to confirm if it was indeed capable of such a precise cut, and more importantly, to find a way to link it directly to her and my severed power line. This felt like a dangerous game, one where I had to tread carefully, because if I misstepped, I could be the one facing trouble. I decided to start by doing some more discreet investigating. I needed to understand that hedge trimmer. I couldn't just waltz over and ask to inspect it, of course. My strategy involved a casual visit to the local hardware store, the very one where Mrs. Albright likely purchased such an item. I pretended to be interested in buying a hedge trimmer for myself, asking the salesperson specific questions about their most powerful models, mentioning the need to cut through tough, thick material. The salesperson, a friendly, middle-aged man named Stan, was eager to help. He led me to a display of heavy-duty trimmers, and there it was, a model identical to the one delivered to Mrs. Albright's house. This baby, Stan explained, gesturing to the gleaming metal blades, can cut through almost anything. Small branches, thick bushes, even some light metal if you're not careful. People use these for serious landscaping, not just a little trim. He demonstrated its power with a loud whir, showing off its sharp, robust teeth. My stomach dropped. It was exactly what Brenda, the utility technician, had described, a tool capable of making a clean, precise cut through a thick power line. The sheer power of it was unsettling. My conviction that Mrs. Albright was responsible solidified even further. The knowledge, however, brought with it a fresh wave of anxiety. She wasn't just petty. She was capable of destructive, and potentially dangerous, acts. Back home, I spent hours poring over community forums and social media groups for Willow Creek. I wasn't looking for direct confessions, but rather any chatter, any subtle clues, or even complaints about Mrs. Albright's behavior from other residents. I found a few disgruntled posts about her strict enforcement of rules, some light-hearted jokes about her eagle eye, but nothing that directly implicated her in anything criminal. It was disheartening, but I wasn't ready to give up. The idea that she could get away with such a blatant act of sabotage fueled my resolve. Then, a stroke of unexpected luck. I stumbled upon a local neighborhood watch group's page. Someone had posted a request for information about a missing cat, and along with it, a short video clip from their doorbell camera, hoping to catch a glimpse of the feline. The video was dated the night my power went out. I watched it, my heart pounding in my chest. The video's primary focus was the street, but in the background, dimly lit by a distant street lamp, I saw it, Mrs. Albright's distinctive silhouette, unmistakable even in the low light, walking briskly down the sidewalk. And then, a fleeting, almost imperceptible detail. She was carrying something. It was long and thin, like a stick, but as she moved into a slightly brighter patch of light, I could just make out a glint of metal. It looked remarkably similar to the heavy-duty hedge trimmer I had seen at the hardware store, especially the way she held it, almost like a staff. The video was grainy, not a clear shot of her face or the tool itself, but the combination of her presence, her typical nighttime patrol routine, and the apparent object in her hand, sent a jolt through me. It wasn't definitive proof, but it added another layer to my growing circumstantial case. The next morning, I decided to take a calculated risk. I needed to gauge Mrs. Albright's reaction, to see if I could rattle her. I printed out a screenshot of the blurry figure from Mr. Henderson's camera, enlarged and slightly enhanced it, though it was still far from clear. I also wrote down the section of the HOA bylaws about financial responsibility for malicious damage. Armed with these, I marched over to her house, taking a deep breath before ringing the doorbell. Mrs. Albright answered, her expression as unreadable as ever. "Good morning," she said, her voice a little colder than usual. She seemed to sense the shift in my demeanor. "Good morning, Mrs. Albright," I replied, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "I've been doing some investigating regarding my power lines." I held up the blurry screenshot. "This is from Mr. Henderson's camera. Not clear, unfortunately, but it shows someone near my lines on the night they were cut. I paused, letting the image sink in. The utility company confirmed it was a deliberate act, by the way. Someone used a very powerful tool. Her eyes flickered to the image, then back to me. A slight tension appeared around her jaw. "And what does this have to do with me?" she asked, her voice tight. "Well," I continued, "I also looked up our HOA bylaws. Did you know that residents are financially responsible for damages caused by their malicious acts? It's a rather significant clause, especially when you consider potential fines from the utility company for tampering with their equipment." I watched her closely. Her composure began to crack. A vein throbbed in her temple. "Are you accusing me, young lady?" she hissed, her voice rising slightly. "That is a very serious accusation." "I'm merely stating facts, Mrs. Albright," I said, trying to maintain a calm exterior. "My power lines were cut, the utility company confirmed it was deliberate, and the potential fines for that kind of action are quite substantial. We're talking thousands, possibly tens of thousands of dollars, that, according to the bylaws, the responsible party would have to pay. Plus, of course, the cost of repairs and any other related expenses. It could easily add up to a very significant amount." I let the number hang in the air, allowing her imagination to conjure up the exact figure. The color drained from her face. Her eyes darted around, almost as if she was looking for an escape route. "This is preposterous. I have no idea what you're talking about. I was home that night, I assure you." Her voice was still sharp, but there was a tremor in it now, a hint of desperation. "Really?" I pressed, deciding to go for the jugular. "Because a neighbor's security camera, in an entirely different context, happened to capture a figure resembling you, carrying what appears to be a large cutting tool, walking past my property shortly after the power went out. It's quite the coincidence, wouldn't you say?" Her face went ashen. Her eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in them. The carefully constructed facade of the indomitable Mrs. Albright began to crumble. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She just stared at me, her chest heaving slightly. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken accusations and the weight of her guilt. I had hit a nerve. I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that she was the one. The fear in her eyes was all the confirmation I needed. But what would she do now that she knew I was onto her? The question hung heavy in the air, a chilling premonition of the battle yet to come. This was far from over. The silence in Mrs. Albright's doorway was deafening, thick with the unsaid truth. Her face, usually so composed, was a mask of shock and a flicker of something close to terror. I had clearly struck a nerve, exposing her carefully guarded secret. The realization that I had found her out hung between us, a tangible thing. This was no longer just about fines and bylaws, it was about the crumbling of her carefully constructed authority. I expected an outburst, a furious denial, but instead, she merely stared, her mouth slightly agape, before slowly, almost imperceptibly, stepping back and closing the door. The soft click echoed in the sudden quiet, leaving me alone on her porch, adrenaline still coursing through my veins. I walked back to my house, my mind racing. I had confronted her, and her reaction spoke volumes. It wasn't a confession, not in words, but it was an undeniable admission of guilt. Now what? The ball was firmly in my court. I had circumstantial evidence, strong suspicions, and her terrified reaction. But to truly hit her with that $80,000 fine, I needed something more concrete, something that would stand up in an official setting, whether it was an HOA hearing or, if necessary, a small claims court. The thought of taking legal action, even a small one, was daunting. I was not a confrontational person by nature, but her actions had crossed a line that I couldn't ignore. This wasn't just about my power, it was about her bullying, her disregard for others, and the need to protect the community from her unreasonable demands. My next step was to consult with someone who understood the nuances of HOA law. I called a local attorney specializing in property law, explaining the situation without revealing Mrs. Albright's name initially, keeping it vague. The attorney listened patiently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I mentioned the potential for an $80,000 fine based on utility company penalties and the HOA's malicious acts clause, there was a noticeable pause on the other end of the line. "That's a significant amount," the attorney stated, her voice thoughtful. "To pursue that, you'd need solid proof. Circumstantial evidence might get you a strong suspicion, but it might not win a case. Do you have any direct evidence, like a clear video, a witness, or perhaps a confession?" I explained Mr. Henderson's blurry video, the neighbor's doorbell camera footage, and Mrs. Albright's reaction to my confrontation. "It's all indirect, I know," I admitted, feeling a pang of frustration. But her reaction was so telling. She was terrified. "Fear can indicate guilt, yes," the attorney conceded, "but it doesn't stand up as evidence in court on its own. You need something more direct. Perhaps a witness who saw her, or even better, physical evidence linking her or her tool to the cut." She suggested that I check if there were any identifiable marks on the severed power line that might match Mrs. Albright's hedge trimmer. She also advised me to formally document everything with the HOA board, not just Mrs. Albright, and to consider filing a police report for utility tampering, as it was a criminal act. This would create an official record and might pressure Mrs. Albright. The idea of involving the police felt extreme, but the attorney emphasized the severity of the act. The next day, still pondering my options, I decided to revisit the spot where my power lines were cut. I needed to see if there was anything I had missed, any tiny detail that could turn suspicion into proof. I examined the cable carefully, remembering Brenda's words about a clean, precise cut. It was indeed remarkably clean. As I knelt, squinting, I noticed something minute, almost invisible to the naked eye. Tucked into the rough edges of the rubber insulation, a few tiny, almost microscopic, metallic slivers gleamed. They were so small I almost dismissed them as random debris. But my mind immediately jumped to the powerful hedge trimmer and its sharp, robust blades. Could these be remnants from the tool that cut my line? A rush of excitement, quickly followed by a cold dread, washed over me. If these slivers could be analyzed and matched to Mrs. Albright's hedge trimmer, it would be undeniable proof. But how would I get a sample from her tool without her knowing? It felt like something out of a spy movie. This was an extreme event, and it pushed me further into a situation I never imagined I'd be in. My thoughts spun wildly as I carefully collected the tiny metallic fragments, placing them in a small, clean plastic bag. This was a crucial piece of the puzzle, potentially the missing link. Later that day, a less extreme but equally unsettling event occurred. As I was pulling into my driveway, I noticed Mrs. Albright's car parked a few houses down, seemingly observing my home. She wasn't just driving by, she was parked there, her head slightly turned towards my house. As soon as she saw me look in her direction, she quickly averted her gaze, started her car, and drove off, but not before I caught a glimpse of her face. It was still etched with that same mixture of fear and something new, resentment. It was a clear sign that my confrontation had shaken her, but also that she was now fully aware of my suspicions and was likely trying to figure out her next move. This surveillance, however brief, added another layer of unease. It felt like she was circling, plotting, and I knew I had to act fast before she did something else, something potentially more damaging. The idea of her retaliating, perhaps with another act of sabotage, filled me with a deep-seated fear. The game of cat and mouse was intensifying, and I needed to find a way to end it before it escalated out of control. I needed to get those metallic slivers analyzed, and I needed a plan to get a sample from her hedge trimmer. The clock was ticking. The tiny metallic slivers I found on the severed power line became my singular focus. They were my golden ticket, the tangible link I needed to expose Mrs. Albright. The challenge, however, was immense. How do you get a forensic analysis done on what might be a few microscopic pieces of metal, and more importantly, how do you obtain a sample from Mrs. Albright's hedge trimmer without raising her suspicions? This felt like a full-blown espionage mission, a far cry from my quiet life in Willow Creek. My initial thought was to go to the police, but I remembered the attorney's advice: they needed concrete evidence to act. Handing them a few specks of metal and a hunch wasn't going to cut it. I needed to build my case stronger first. I spent hours online, researching private forensic labs, but most seemed geared towards larger-scale investigations, and the cost was prohibitive for a private citizen. The desperation grew, a knot tightening in my stomach with each passing hour. Mrs. Albright's unsettling surveillance confirmed she was aware of my suspicions, and I worried she might try to cover her tracks, or worse, escalate her actions. A glimmer of hope appeared when I remembered a distant cousin, a quirky but brilliant woman named Sarah, who was a materials science engineer. She worked in a university lab, and while her specialty wasn't forensics, I knew she had access to advanced microscopes and analysis equipment. I called her, carefully explaining the situation, omitting Mrs. Albright's name and framing it as a hypothetical case of a friend needing help identifying tiny metal fragments. Sarah, always up for a puzzle, was intrigued. "Send me what you've got," she instructed, her voice buzzing with intellectual curiosity. "I can't promise anything, but I can at least tell you what kind of metal it is, maybe even trace elements if we're lucky." Carefully, I packaged the minuscule slivers, sending them off to her with express shipping. The wait was excruciating. Every passing siren, every rustle outside my window, made me jump. I found myself constantly looking out for Mrs. Albright, observing her house, trying to anticipate her next move. The tension in the neighborhood felt palpable, at least to me. Other residents seemed oblivious, caught up in their own daily routines, reinforcing my sense of isolation in this personal vendetta. While waiting for Sarah's analysis, the more immediate problem of getting a sample from Mrs. Albright's hedge trimmer loomed. This was the riskiest part of my plan. I couldn't just knock on her door and ask to borrow it. I needed an opportunity, a moment when the trimmer would be accessible and, crucially, when she wouldn't be around. My surveillance of her house became more intense, bordering on obsessive. I noted her routine, her morning walks, her grocery runs, her weekly bridge club meetings. One Tuesday afternoon, the perfect opportunity presented itself. Mrs. Albright left her house, meticulously locking the front door, and drove off in her car, presumably heading to her bridge club. I knew she'd be gone for at least 3 hours. My heart pounded. This was it. I had noticed that she kept her new hedge trimmer in a small, unlocked shed in her backyard, partially visible from my fence if you squinted. It was a bold move, almost unbelievably reckless, but the risk felt necessary. Taking a deep breath, I slipped out my back gate and cautiously approached her property. My hands were shaking slightly as I pushed open the shed door. There it was, the powerful hedge trimmer, gleaming ominously in the dim light of the shed. I pulled out a small, sterile cotton swab and a clean plastic baggie I had prepared. With surgical precision, I scraped the cotton swab along a few of the blades, particularly where they seemed to have microscopic nicks or dull spots. I imagined tiny fragments of my power line, or even traces of the cable's insulation, might be clinging there. It was a terrifying act, my fingers fumbling with the swab, constantly glancing over my shoulder, convinced at any moment she would return. I then quickly sealed the swab in the baggie, closed the shed door as carefully as I could, and scurried back to my own yard, my heart hammering against my ribs. I felt a surge of triumph, quickly followed by a wave of nausea. I had done it. A few days later, Sarah called. Her voice was excited. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "The fragments you sent me are definitely from an insulated electrical cable." And, she paused for dramatic effect, I found microscopic traces of a specific metal alloy. It's often used in the blades of high-power cutting tools, like industrial hedge trimmers. It's a pretty distinct signature. My breath hitched. And what about the sample from the tool? I asked, trying to keep my voice even. I had sent her the swab from Mrs. Albright's hedge trimmer a day after I retrieved it, inventing a story about it being from another friend's garden tool that needed sharpening. That's the kicker, Sarah continued. The metal alloy on your second sample, from the garden tool, perfectly matches the fragments from the cable. I mean, perfectly. It's the same type of metal, same trace elements, everything. It's incredibly strong evidence that whatever cut your cable, also has residue from that second tool. The line went silent for a moment as her words sank in. Perfect match. This was it. This was the irrefutable proof I needed. My hands trembled, not from fear now, but from a surge of vindication. The $80,000 fine suddenly didn't feel like a pipe dream. It was a looming reality for Mrs. Albright. The overwhelming relief was quickly followed by a new surge of anxiety. I had the evidence, but now I had to use it. How would she react when confronted with undeniable proof? What new depths of desperation would she plumb to escape responsibility? The thought sent a chill down my spine. The game was no longer just about evidence, it was about the impending confrontation, and what that would unleash. I knew Mrs. Albright wouldn't go down without a fight, and I had a feeling her next move would be even more extreme. Sarah's confirmation of the perfectly matching metal alloy sent a surge of power through me. The tiny fragments from my severed power line and the microscopic residue from Mrs. Albright's hedge trimmer were now undeniable proof. I had it, the smoking gun that would link her directly to the act. The $80,000 fine, once a distant dream, felt like a certainty, a justified consequence for her malicious behavior. Yet, the victory was tinged with apprehension. I knew Mrs. Albright was not one to concede defeat gracefully, and a cornered animal can be the most dangerous. This final confrontation would be volatile. I decided to involve the HOA board officially. Not just Mrs. Albright, but the entire board. I scheduled an emergency meeting, sending them a concise email outlining a serious violation of community rules, including property damage and potential criminal activity, without naming Mrs. Albright directly. I hinted at irrefutable evidence and the significant financial implications. The formal tone ensured they understood the gravity of the situation. They responded quickly, agreeing to meet the following evening. The day of the meeting felt endless. I spent hours preparing, organizing my evidence, the utility company report, Mr. Henderson's video footage, the neighbor's doorbell camera clip, the detailed notes from my conversation with the attorney, and most crucially, Sarah's scientific analysis report, complete with technical jargon and magnified images of the matching metal alloys. I rehearsed my presentation, trying to anticipate Mrs. Albright's arguments and denials. I wanted to present the facts calmly, logically, and undeniably. There would be no room for her usual bluster and intimidation. As evening approached, a strange sense of calm settled over me. I wasn't nervous, I was resolute. This wasn't just about me or my power lines anymore. It was about standing up for everyone in Willow Creek who had been subjected to Mrs. Albright's unreasonable demands and bullying tactics. It was about showing that empathy and kindness should prevail over rigid, heartless rules. The HOA meeting room, usually a quiet space for mundane discussions about landscaping and common area maintenance, felt charged with anticipation. The other board members, a mix of retirees and busy professionals, sat around the long table, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. Mrs. Albright was already there, seated ramrod straight, her face a mask of practiced indifference, though I noticed a slight tremor in her hands. She refused to meet my gaze. I began my presentation, starting with the timeline of events, the power outage, the utility company's diagnosis of a deliberate cut, and the potential fines for tampering with utility infrastructure. As I spoke, I noticed Mrs. Albright's jaw tightening, her eyes darting between me and the other board members. When I mentioned the HOA bylaw regarding financial responsibility for malicious acts, her knuckles whitened as she gripped the table. Then, I brought out the core of my evidence. Mr. Henderson's camera caught a figure near my power line around the time of the incident, I stated, displaying the blurry screenshot. And another neighbor's doorbell camera, seeking a lost cat, captured a figure resembling Mrs. Albright carrying what appeared to be a powerful cutting tool, walking past my property shortly after. A gasp rippled through the room, and the other board members turned to stare at Mrs. Albright, whose face had now gone beet red. "This is outrageous. Mrs. Albright finally burst out, her voice shrill, unable to maintain her composure. "These are baseless accusations. You have no proof." "On the contrary, Mrs. Albright," I countered, my voice steady and clear. I pulled out Sarah's report and laid it on the table. When the utility company repaired my lines, I collected microscopic metal fragments embedded in the cut insulation. I had these fragments analyzed by a materials science engineer. The results are conclusive. I paused, letting the words hang in the air. The fragments are from an insulated electrical cable. And, more importantly, they contain a unique metal alloy, characteristic of high-power cutting tools. Furthermore, I took a deep breath, I obtained a sample from your recently acquired heavy-duty hedge trimmer, which also contained this identical, distinct metal alloy. The scientific conclusion is that the tool that cut my power lines is the same tool you own, Mrs. Albright. Silence descended upon the room, a stunned, heavy silence. Mrs. Albright's eyes widened to saucers. Her face drained of all color, turning a ghostly white. She looked utterly trapped, cornered by irrefutable facts. The other board members exchanged shocked glances, their disbelief slowly morphing into anger. This is impossible." Mrs. Albright stammered, her voice barely a whisper, a stark contrast to her usual booming pronouncements. You broke into my shed. That's trespass. You illegally obtained a sample. Your shed was unlocked, Mrs. Albright, I stated calmly, and any trespass would be minor compared to the criminal act of cutting utility lines. Furthermore, your reaction right now speaks volumes. Denials are no longer enough. The evidence is undeniable. The utility company is prepared to issue significant fines for this act of sabotage, which, according to Article 7, Section C, Paragraph 2 of our own HOA bylaws, you, as the responsible party, are liable for. The initial estimate for these fines, combined with the cost of repair and my attorney's fees, totals approximately $80,000. The number hung in the air, a colossal sum. Mrs. Albright gasped, a choked sound escaping her lips. Her eyes darted frantically around the room, then landed on me, filled with a raw, desperate fury. It was a look of pure hatred, not just for the money, but for the humiliation, for the collapse of her carefully constructed authority. Suddenly, her composure shattered completely. With a guttural cry of rage, she lunged across the table, knocking over a pitcher of water and several stacks of documents. Her hand shot out, aiming for my face. It was a wild, desperate, and utterly unhinged attack. Before anyone could react, Mrs. Albright, the meticulous HOA Karen, had fully transformed into a furious, cornered beast, intent on inflicting physical harm. The entire board erupted in shouts and gasps, and the meeting dissolved into utter chaos. This was indeed a wild ending, one nobody could have predicted. The fate of the $80,000 fine, and Mrs. Albright's future in Willow Creek, hung precariously in the balance, as the room descended into an alarming maelstrom of shock and desperation.